Roman Black didn't just enter his penthouse. He reclaimed it like a king returning from a bloody conquest. He was the city's most dangerous phantom, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom deals and back-alley negotiations with equal parts terror and respect. After 20 hours of crushing a hostile takeover that left his competitors bankrupt, he stepped into his sanctuary expecting the raw, metallic scent of sandalwood to sharpen his focus. Instead, he was hit by the cloying, amateur smell of lavender. It was soft. It was weak. It was a violation. He halted, his gaze turning into shards of ice as it fell on the estate manager, Marcus. The man stood there with a confident, polished grin, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking on a landmine. "I took the liberty of updating the ambience, Mr. Black," Marcus said, his voice brimming with unearned pride. "Lavender promotes a sense of peace." Roman didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, the silence in the room growing heavy enough to crush bone. "Peace is a luxury for the stagnant, Marcus," Roman murmured, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "And your liberty just cost you everything." In under 5 minutes, the entire security and domestic team were standing on the sidewalk, their reputations blacklisted before they even reached their cars. All because of a scent. Before the story gets even more intense, subscribe if you love seeing the powerful finally meet their match. Tell us in the comments, was Roman right? Or did he overreact? By the next morning, the Lavender Massacre was the only thing the city's elite could talk about. In high-end country clubs and glass-walled skyscrapers, the story mutated with every whisper. Some said he fired them because they moved his collection of rare obsidian. Others swore it was because a maid had looked him directly in the eye. They called him unhinged, a billionaire with the soul of a mafia don who thrived on chaos and absolute control. But while the tabloids were busy painting him as a monster, Roman was sitting in his silent, sandalwood-scented fortress, feeling a hollow ache he couldn't explain. He didn't want employees. He wanted ghosts. He needed someone who could move through his life without leaving a single footprint, someone who understood that in his world, being noticed was a liability. Little did he know, 300 miles away in a dusty recruitment office, a woman named Ilara Vance was looking at his file. Her boss, a hardened veteran of the service industry, warned her that Roman Black was a career killer, a man who had burned through 7 agencies in less than 2 years. But Ilara didn't flinch. She didn't care about his reputation or his billions. She had spent her entire life learning how to be invisible, how to anticipate needs before they were even felt, and how to exist in the margins of other people's lives. When her boss asked if she could handle a man who wanted a phantom instead of a person, Ilara simply reached for the folder with a steady hand. She wasn't looking for a paycheck. She was looking for a way back into a life she had lost 2 decades ago, and Roman Black was the only key. As she signed the contract, the sleeve of her sweater slipped, revealing a strange, weathered ring made of twisted copper wire and a dull piece of blue sea glass, a piece of trash that she guarded like the crown jewels. The penthouse, a brutalist masterpiece of steel and glass perched over the city, was designed to intimidate anyone who dared to enter. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress, a cold monument to Roman's power. Ilara arrived at exactly 4 a.m., the hour when the city held its breath and the shadows were at their deepest. The previous staff had left the place in a state of silent panic, half-eaten gourmet meals left to rot on the obsidian counters and dust settling on the priceless artifacts like a shroud. Ilara didn't waste a second. She stepped out of her shoes, replacing them with soft, hand-knit wool socks that turned her footsteps into whispers against the polished concrete. She worked with the focus of a ghost, moving through the cavernous rooms and erasing every trace of the chaos. She found the hidden ventilation controls and dialed back the clinical, freezing air, shifting the smart lighting from a harsh, interrogation white to a deep, amber glow that softened the jagged edges of the furniture. In the kitchen, she didn't just make coffee. She placed a single glass of room-temperature water infused with a hint of mint next to the machine, a silent gesture for a man who likely forgot to breathe between deals. By the time the first ray of sun hit the skyline, she had spent 9 hours in constant motion. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't sat down, and most importantly, she hadn't made a single sound. When Roman finally returned that evening, he stopped at the threshold. The air didn't bite anymore. It welcomed him. The scent of sandalwood was back, but it was layered with something else. Something clean, something that felt like a memory of a place he couldn't quite name. He searched the rooms, his predatory instincts on high alert for an intruder, but found nothing. No fingerprints, no lingering perfume, not even a misplaced chair. Just the water waiting for him and a house that finally felt like it wasn't trying to kill him. Something shifted in his chest, a spark of something dangerous and buried, but he quickly choked it out. That night, for the first time in years, the city's most dangerous man fell asleep without a drink in his hand, watching a single flame flicker in the dark. For 3 weeks, Roman lived with a shadow. He never saw her, never heard her, and yet her presence was stitched into the very fabric of his daily life. His shirts were pressed with a precision that bordered on art. His favorite rare scotch appeared on the side table exactly 6 minutes after he walked through the door, and the house felt alive. It was exactly what he had demanded, a ghost who served without being seen, and yet, it was driving him insane. He found himself setting traps, coming home at odd hours, or lingering in the hallways, hoping to catch a stray reflection in the glass. He told himself it was about security, about making sure this phantom wasn't a corporate spy, but deep down, a part of him was terrified by how well she knew him. She knew his headaches before he felt them, adjusting the lights to a specific frequency. She knew he hated the silence of the foyer, leaving a vintage record player spinning at a volume so low it was almost a heartbeat. One afternoon, a rare fever laid him low, forcing him to cancel a high-stakes board meeting. He was slumped in his leather chair, staring at a wall of monitors, when he saw her on the security feed. She was in the library, dusting his collection of first editions with a grace that made her look like she was dancing with the books. She was smaller than he imagined, dressed in a muted gray that bled into the shadows, her dark hair pulled back in a tight no-nonsense knot. But then, the afternoon sun broke through the smog and hit her hand, and Roman's heart didn't just skip, it stopped. There, on her finger, was a ring that had no business being in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. It was a crude, ugly thing made of rusted copper wire, twisted around a jagged piece of pale blue sea glass. It was a piece of junk he hadn't seen in 20 years, but he would recognize it in the dark of a grave. His hand trembled as he reached for the screen, his mind screaming that it was impossible. That ring was a promise made by a dirty-faced boy in a rainy alleyway a lifetime ago. A promise he thought had died the day the system tore them apart. The memory hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back 2 decades to the iron-fisted halls of St. Jude's Home for Boys. Back then, he wasn't Roman Black. He was just Roma, a scrawny kid with bruised knuckles and a defiant glare that hid a hollow stomach. The orphanage was a place where hope went to rot, but in the middle of that grey misery, there had been Elara. She was the only one who didn't flinch when he lashed out, the only soul who saw the king hidden beneath the rags. He remembered the night he stole a length of copper wiring from the maintenance shed, his fingers bleeding as he twisted it into a shape that was supposed to be beautiful. He had found a shard of blue sea glass in the gravel, the exact color of the winter sky, and pressed it into the center of the wire. "When I'm the most powerful man in this city," he had whispered to her under the flickering light of a street lamp, "I'm going to replace this with a diamond so bright it'll blind the sun." Elara had laughed, that soft musical sound that was the only melody in his world, and told him she didn't want diamonds. She wanted the boy who made rings out of trash. But then came the night of the reallocation. The black vans had arrived, social workers pulling them apart while he fought like a caged animal, screaming her name until his throat burned. He had spent 20 years climbing a mountain of bodies and broken deals to make sure no one could ever take anything from him again, convinced that the boy who made copper rings had died in that alleyway. Yet here she was, standing in his library, wearing the same rusted promise on her finger. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he watched her on the screen. Was this a setup? Had his enemies found the one weakness he had buried under $1 billion? Or was it possible that after a lifetime of searching for power, the only thing that actually mattered had walked right through his front door? Roman stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the one being hunted by a ghost from his own past. Roman decided to play a dangerous game, testing the ghost in his halls to see if she truly remembered the boy he used to be. The next morning, he left an old, battered copy of a classic adventure novel on the coffee table, the very same book they had shared in the orphanage's drafty attic, taking turns reading by the light of a stolen candle. He watched through the hidden lenses as Alara approached it during her rounds. She stopped. Her entire body went rigid, and for a long minute, she didn't breathe. Slowly, almost as if she were afraid it might vanish, she reached out and traced the frayed edges of the spine. She didn't cry, but the way she pressed the book against her chest, eyes closed in a silent prayer, told Roman everything he needed to know. Instead of putting it back on the shelf, she placed it on his bedside table, angled perfectly so it would be the first thing he saw before sleep. Over the next week, the silent conversation deepened. He left a small bag of the cheap, sour cherry candies they used to trade for favors. She responded by leaving a single, perfectly folded origami crane made from a plain white napkin, the only toy he had ever known how to make for her. Every interaction was a heartbeat, a message sent across a canyon of 20 years. He found himself neglecting multi-billion-dollar mergers just to watch her through the monitors, mesmerized by how she moved through his world with a tenderness he didn't deserve. He was a man who lived for the kill, a shark in a suit, yet he was being dismantled by a woman who wouldn't even look him in the eye. The tension in the penthouse became electric, a storm gathering in the silence. He knew he had to confront her, to scream her name and demand to know why she had waited so long, but the fear of shattering the fragile peace she had brought him kept him paralyzed. He was a billionaire with the world at his feet, yet he was hiding in his own office, terrified of a girl with a copper ring. The breaking point arrived on the night of the winter solstice gala. Roman's publicist had forced him to host the event, a gathering of the city's most venomous socialites and power brokers, all designed to soften his image. The penthouse was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, but Roman stood in the center like a stone in a rushing river, his eyes scanning for a shadow. He saw her near the catering station, blending into the background as she directed a fleet of servers with her signature quiet authority. Then, disaster struck. Juliana Thorne, a woman whose cruelty was as famous as her family's fortune, was waving a glass of vintage red wine too close to a white silk installation. A careless gesture, a stumble on a 4-inch heel, and the liquid arced through the air like a spray of blood. Alara moved with the reflexes of someone who had spent a lifetime dodging blows, stepping between Juliana and the expensive fabric. The wine splashed across Alara's grey uniform, staining it a deep, ugly crimson. The room went silent as Juliana's face twisted with embarrassment, which she immediately channeled into rage. "You stupid, invisible little girl!" Juliana shrieked, her voice cutting through the classical music. "Do you have any idea how much this evening costs? You've ruined the mood with your clumsiness." Alara stood perfectly still, absorbing the insults with a dignity that made the billionaire socialite look small. But Juliana wasn't done. She reached out and grabbed Alara's wrist, yanking her hand up to mock her. "And what is this garbage?" she laughed, pointing at the copper ring. "Are we hiring beggars now? This belongs in a trash can, not a penthouse." Before the final confrontation, subscribe if you believe loyalty is worth more than gold. The sound of Roman's footsteps across the marble floor was like the ticking of a countdown clock. The room went deathly silent as he cut through the crowd, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury that made even the toughest investors step back in fear. Juliana Thorne, still clutching Alara's wrist, looked up with a smug smile, expecting Roman to join in on the humiliation. Instead, Roman dropped to one knee. The collective gasp from the socialites was audible as the man who owned the city reached out and gently, so gently it looked like he was handling a dying butterfly, picked up the copper ring that had been knocked to the floor. He didn't care about the cameras, the wine-stained carpet, or the fact that his reputation was being dismantled in real time. He stood up, towering over Juliana, and his voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "Mrs. Thorne," he whispered, his eyes burning with a light no one had ever seen before. "You could spend 10 lifetimes working and you still wouldn't have the dignity required to breathe the same air as this ring." He took Alara's hand, his fingers trembling, and slid the copper wire back onto her finger where it belonged. "Get out," he commanded, not even looking at Juliana. "Every one of you. The party is over." As the stunned guests scrambled for the exits, Roman finally looked at the woman who had been his ghost for 3 weeks. He didn't see the housekeeper in the stained uniform. He saw the girl from the alleyway, the only person who had ever loved him for nothing. "I found you," he choked out, the armor he had worn for 20 years finally cracking wide open. "Elara, I've spent my whole life trying to be a king just so I could find the girl who gave me a reason to survive." The next morning, the fortress felt like a home for the first time. There were no more monitors, no more traps, and no more ghosts. Roman and Elara sat on the balcony as the sun rose over the city they had both conquered in their own ways. He had offered her the diamonds he once promised, but she had only shaken her head and touched the copper wire on her hand. She didn't need his billions. She just needed the boy who hadn't forgotten his word. Roman realized then that his empire wasn't built of steel and glass. It was built on the memory of a promise made in a rainy orphanage yard. He stepped down from his role as the Mafia Boss of the corporate world, using his wealth to rebuild the very systems that had tried to break them as children. The moral of our story is that power and money can build a palace, but only loyalty can turn it into a home. We spend our lives chasing things that shine, forgetting that the most valuable treasures are often the ones we made out of trash when we had nothing else. If Roman and Elara's journey reminded you that true love never forgets, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't let go of the people who knew you when you were nothing. They are the only ones who truly know you now. See you in the next story.